earlier. Great. I started recording. Now, let's go to the board. Now here, I'll just close this. Great. International relations theories. Continuation, of course. Here we say continued. Now, two theories are going to be discussed today. One is Marxism as a theory of international relations. In this particular case, Marxism, before I start talking about it as a theory of international relations, I have to say this from the very beginning. Marxism is not a theory of international relations. It is simply a philosophy, a political philosophy, you could say, or to be more exact, an international political economic philosophy. Regardless of that, Marxism has been the basis of many international relations theories commonly known as critical theories of international relations. Each one of these critical theories has taken an aspect of Marxism and has applied it in their theories. Now, let's start with a very short introduction into Marxism and what Marxism is and what Marxism is not as well. So Marxism is essentially a critique of capitalism. So the whole idea behind Marxism was to find the fault lines in capitalism and to show how those fault lines will eventually lead to the fall of capitalism and supposedly a proletariat revolution. Now, let's put it this way. Interestingly, most people think that Marx was anti-capitalist out and out. But in reality, that was not necessarily the case. Marx and Engels did believe that capitalism has led to a great level of development in the world. However, and this is the most important addition, however, capitalism is inherently a discriminatory system in which a huge gap is created between those who have access to the means of investment. In this particular case, we mean money, and those who have no other way to survive in the world except by selling their manual services, meaning their manpower, bodily power, or their mental power even. So they're either geniuses who can work for the capitalist class in the sense that they create, let's say they invent new stuff for them, or they work for the capitalist class in the factories, in all those industrial complexes. The huge gap that is created between the bourgeois, basically those who have access to the means of investment, and the proletariat, or the working class, eventually leads to the working class revolting against the capitalist class, or the bourgeois. A huge gap between the rich. Again, please correct me if I'm wrong, because this is a French word. I'm not sure if I'm writing it correctly. And the proletariat, which is the working class. Will eventually lead to a revolution by the working class. This revolution topples the capitalist system and establishes in its first phase, it establishes a socialist system in which the resources of the society are shared equally among its members. But this does not mean that the socialist society or the socialist system, sorry. Oh, okay, this is so. Why did this happen? Socialist system in which the resources of the society. Okay, this does not mean that the socialist system does not accept private property. In fact, during the first phase, when the socialist system has been created, the private property system is still in place. So people can have ownership over the different resources that exist in the society, over land, over whatever it is. But there is a second phase in Marxism called communism. And in the communist phase, the resources will be shared among the members of the society equally, in a more equal and egalitarian sense. And the private ownership of resources is completely nullified. I'm not going to write about the second phase because the first phase is perhaps the only logical phase to deal with here. Anyways, for the purpose of this particular course, all we have to know is that Marxism is essentially about conflict between classes, conflict between two different groups. Well, in its economic shape, it talks about the bourgeois and the proletariat, two classes, two economic classes in the society that go against each other, and the clash of their interests leads to a revolution that topples the capitalist system and establishes a socialist system. But this is not the way this is not necessarily the way critical theories have adopted Marxism, and we will talk about those theories here as well. But the most important thing for us is to understand this clash in Marxism between two or more groups. Critical theories of international relations. I'm going to write them under each other because they are completely related to each other. Critical theories of international relations have their roots, or at least the majority of them have their roots in Marxism. They do talk about clashes of interests. They do talk about different, perhaps not classes, but different groups in the society going against each other. and not necessarily only in economic sense, but also in ideological sense. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about some of them. First of all, critical theory refers to a large number of theories that have their roots in Marxism, but not necessarily economic Marxism. These theories, just like Marxism, are essentially about clashes between different groups in the society. I will show it to you how this is relevant and how this determines political decision making in a society. Okay, let's talk about some of these critical theories. Just to give you an example, there is a theory in international relations called the world systems theory. The world systems theory is literally the application of Marxism, which was based on the internal structures of nation states, to international relations. So Marxism has been taken out of its context and applied to a case that does not necessarily fall into its original formulation. Now, what is world systems theory? To put it simply, world systems theory says that although today we do not live in a world where colonies exist, right? Although we do not live in a world where colonialization is the dominant trend, the world has indeed been divided into three different categories. The first category of states is called the core. The second category of states is called the semi-periphery. And the third category of states, according to the world systems theory, is called the periphery. Now, what are these three? The first category, the core countries, are the richest, the most developed, and countries in the world who also enjoy the most developed social security systems. The semi-periphery countries are somehow rich, but not necessarily as rich as the core countries. They do have some developed or somehow developed social security systems that are functioning but are not as good as the core countries. Their infrastructure is not as developed as the core, but it's not too bad either. And then we have, of course, the periphery countries. And the periphery countries are the poorest of the poor. They do not really have developed infrastructure. They do not have a well-established social security system. They do not necessarily have access to the resources that they need to develop their economies. So the world has been divided into these three categories, and it's really hard to go from one category to another, meaning that if you're in the if you're among the periphery countries, it is really hard to move to semi-periphery or the core because you have been locked through a system of trade. You have been locked in a system where it would be impossible for you to have access to the technology or to the money that you need, in other words, to the fund that you need to develop your infrastructure and to develop your economy to an extent that you become a semi-periphery or a core country. Now, if you're in the semi-periphery, there is a possibility that you will become a core because you do have some of the features of the core countries, meaning the most developed countries, but not necessarily exactly where the core countries are. But it's easier for you to get into the core category. However, it's not as easy as you would think because you're also locked into the same economic system. Now, consider it this way. Which countries would you put in the core? I guess we all know, for example, that the United States would be there, the United States of America. Although the United States of America does not really have a very developed social security system. In fact, when it comes to social security, the United States is one of the least developed, simply because it has an unregulated capitalist system. But because of its development, because of how it has been developed, because of its superpower status, it can be put among the core countries. What other countries do we put there? We could put most Western European countries in this category, the core countries, right? So Germany, France, um,
Great Britain.
Belgium, um, Switzerland. Uh, what else? I mean, all these countries fall into that category. Other than these countries, most countries do not really fall into the core category. Canada also falls into the core category because it also has developed industries. Although Canada is somewhere in between the semi-periphery and the core, in the sense that its industries are to a great extent reliant on the United States investment and the United States industries. Oh, yes, Anelia mentioned a very important thing here. The fact that I just said Western European countries and the United States does not mean that we don't have core countries in Asia or in Africa. In fact, I was just referring to the most obvious cases here. But yes, Anelia is right. In the chat section, Anelia has written Singapore is also among the core. It is true, actually. Singapore is among the core countries in the sense that it is one of the richest countries in the world. It does have very developed infrastructure as well because it has the funds to deal with that infrastructure. The only problem with Singapore, perhaps, is that when it comes to industries, it is not necessarily it does not have the most developed industries in the world. However, that is understandable because of how small Singapore is. So they could not really develop such industrial structure there, and they don't really need it. All they have to do is what they have been doing in the last couple of decades, so they can bring in foreign investors, foreign direct investment, and develop their economy. And they've been doing a great job there. Now, Survival has mentioned Australia and New Zealand there. Yes, Australia and New Zealand are, again, just like Canada. One of the reasons I didn't mention them is that just like Canada, They do have a very developed economy. They do have a very developed social security system, but their industries are completely dependent on more developed countries. Especially with New Zealand, New Zealand's economy is agrarian in the sense that most of what New Zealand exports to other countries is related to farming and agriculture. Australia has the same problem as well. However, both countries are highly developed. So you're right, we can actually put them in the core category. Most scholars actually do put them in the core category because of how their infrastructure has developed. So they're very developed. However, this development is to a great extent because of the fact that they are part of the Commonwealth, not necessarily because they have developed very advanced industries in the countries. New Zealand doesn't really need industries. It's just like Singapore. It's not really that big. It is a big country, but it's not that big. And its economy so far is doing very well because of its agricultural products and because it has invested highly in high-tech industries. So I can actually take my words back and say, well, yes, even though New Zealand does not have industries in the sense that it does not produce things, but it does produce a lot of high-tech products. So thank you, Survival, for that contribution. Thank you, Anelia, as well. Deborah asked a very interesting question as well. How can we consider Turkey? It's a very interesting case, actually. Turkey has been able to develop its industries in the last couple of decades, especially after the revolution in Iran, because the foreign direct investment changed its route from Iran to Turkey. After the revolution in Iran in the 1970s, most of that foreign direct investment moved to Turkey. Turkey has been able to develop its economy in the last 40 years, especially in the last 20 years, I would say. It has developed its economy, but it does not fall into the core. We cannot really put Turkey in the core category. It still needs to develop its infrastructure, both industrial infrastructure and its social security system, for it to be considered among the core countries. And remember, most of the core countries that we are speaking of also enjoy a high level of democracy in their countries. So they're liberal democratic countries, the majority of them at least are liberal democratic countries. I did not even put China there. Not because China is not a developed country, but because its development still does not suffice simply because it has a very large population. Turkey does not fall into the core, it somehow falls into the semi-periphery. How can we classify Cyprus? Well, in the case of Cyprus, it's really hard to classify Cyprus, to be honest with you. It is a very small state. It is not necessarily a very developed state, especially the northern part. The southern part of Cyprus is more developed than the north. It is part of the European Union, so it has access to the European Union funds as well. The north is supposedly, on paper, it is part of the European Union, but all European Union laws have been put on suspension, have been suspended in regards to the northern parts of Cyprus until a solution has been found to the Cyprus problem. whether Cyprus is going to have two independent states or whether it's going to be a federal state in the future. So I cannot really put it in the core. I cannot even put it in the semi-periphery. I would say that Cyprus is actually in the periphery, not in the semi-periphery even though it is much higher in terms of development of infrastructure and of social security systems than most periphery countries. I would say than all periphery countries, but it's because of its underdevelopment, industrial, especially underdevelopment, I cannot really even put it in the semi-periphery. Interestingly, I would put countries like Russia, for example, in the semi-periphery of the world, Russia and China. So they're not really as developed as you would expect them to be. Most of the wealth of the country is concentrated in parts of the country like Moscow, St. Petersburg, the western part of Russia, basically. But the eastern parts are not as developed, even though there are very developed cities in the eastern part of Russia as well. However, again, Russia is not, in terms of infrastructure, it is not one of the most developed countries in the world. In terms of social security systems, it is not one of the most developed countries in the world. That is why I would categorize Russia. Again, you could object to that. You could say that Russia is indeed developed, but I would put it in the semi-periphery, not in the periphery. China is the same thing. So China is developed, but not as developed as you would want it to be or expect it to be. It is turning into a superpower, not in the short run, though. In the long run, it may become a superpower or not. But because of its very large population, it's impossible for it to reach that level, at least at the moment. How need each other, right? Okay, yeah. So survival has asked, these questions are interesting, actually, very good, because it shows me what I have to focus on. It says, okay, despite this different categories, how are they related to each other? And I will talk about that because that's one of the most important aspects of the world systems theory. In fact, what the world systems theory says is that what happens between these three different categories is those countries that are in the core invest heavily in industries that require a lot of funds, in a lot of know-how, right? And these are high-tech industries. So these countries are developing because of their advanced high-tech industries. Other countries in the semi-periphery and the periphery, especially in the periphery, provide the countries in the core with agricultural products that the core countries need. And those in the semi-periphery have features of both. So they produce agricultural products, export them to other countries, but they also are able to develop high-tech industries as well. So that is why they somehow fall in between the two. They have features of the core, they have features of the periphery. But because the countries in the periphery are highly dependent on agricultural products only, or on not just agricultural products, but on extraction of resources, for example. Like a country like Saudi Arabia is very rich, right? But it's not among the semi-periphery or the core. It's actually a periphery country because it does not have developed infrastructure, it does not have developed industries, it has not invested heavily on high-tech industries either. And it does not really have, well, they do have a social security system, a sort of social security system, but still it falls short of the core countries in the world. And consider it this way, the moment oil finishes in a country like Saudi Arabia, the extraction of oil finishes, or the world moves to green energy, then a country like Saudi Arabia will start a downward fall. Well, all fall is downward, so that was a syllogism. But anyways, all countries in the Middle East region have the same problem, for example. They are stuck in a system where they produce, they extract, sorry, not produce, but they extract their resources, mainly oil and gas. They send it to the poor countries because they need it for their industries. They start producing high-tech and those products that require advanced know-how, and then they send it back to those countries. In this system, it's just like the capitalist system where the rich becomes richer, the poor becomes poorer. The poor countries become richer and more advanced, and the periphery countries become poorer and become the least advanced countries in the world. In fact, it is not in the interest of the poor countries to let the periphery countries develop themselves, develop their infrastructure, and the liberal economic system that exists in the world somehow leads to these countries being stuck in their positions and the underdevelopment of the periphery countries in the world. So as you can see, the world systems theory has its roots directly in Marxism. Okay, yes. In the chat section, I have another question. Countries do have so much resources that they make them rich, but they lack the infrastructure to manage or handle their resources. That's true. That is indeed true. They don't have the resources, and sometimes the ruling classes are also not interested in developing the necessary infrastructure. Let me put it this way. A couple of 100 years ago, one of the Middle Eastern kings had made a recommendation to his successor, saying that if you want to rule the people in this region, keep them undereducated or illiterate, basically, and hungry, if I remember the words correctly. Now, why is that? Because if you're going to have a totalitarian system, if you're going to rule as a dictator, then it would not be in your interest for your people to be educated. It would not be in your interest for your people to have access to resources, for them to be rich, right? So you try to keep them undereducated, poor, and this is, of course, a very controversial statement, but this is the truth of regions like the Middle East, unfortunately, most countries in Africa as well. So the idea is to keep the people as underdeveloped as possible, keep those countries as underdeveloped as possible, so they won't try even to change the system, to turn things upside down. Now, this does not just happen economically, this also happens ideologically. So the ideology that was imported or basically exported to the non-Western world, not all of it, of course, part of it, has been there for years, and it functions as a filter that does not let people see themselves as equals to the Western world, or those countries see themselves as equals to the Western world. Most of the countries, and this is another critical theory that I'm discussing right now, colonialism or post-colonialism basically is another critical theory, and let's explain that as well. Most of the countries that were colonies before and are now independent states are still stuck in some kind of an inferiority complex, meaning that they see themselves as inferior to their former colonies. So, for example, if you go to a country that was colonized by France um, in the past and is now an independent state, you will see a lot of inferiority complex, especially among the political elite. How is that shaped in the post-colonial world? It's very easy. You go to countries, let's say the political elite is educated, the majority of them are educated in the former colonial powers. They see the development there, they see the underdevelopment in their own countries, they see the differences in the cultures, they attribute the underdevelopment necessarily to the difference in the cultures, and they think that structurally speaking, those countries, the African countries, the Asian countries, whatever country was under colonial rule, is not capable of becoming equal to the former colonizers, colonizing power. Now, what happens is, in the long run, the political elite who has been educated in the same system as the colonizing powers now tries to implement the same ideas, the same ideology, the same even religion as the former colonizing powers in the state, effectively and unconsciously thinking of their culture, their ideas, their ideology, their way of life as inferior. I'm not saying this to say that this is wrong all the time, that this is a mistake. I'm just saying this to say the countries are locked in a system, in an ideological system, former colonies, that makes them think of themselves as inferiors. Now, just to give you an example, and I'm not trying to offend anyone, please don't be offended if you're from those countries. Uh, Cameroon, for example, has been under colonial power before, right? Now, the way, because I have a lot of Cameroonian friends, and whenever I speak with them, they do somehow feel of the former colonizers as a superior power. They are, because they are more advanced, but it does not necessarily mean that Cameroon cannot be there. However, Cameroon has been locked in a system of conflict and conflictual interests that does not let it grow, does not let it develop. And its development is also not in the interest of the multinational corporations that have their roots and have their headquarters in the former colonial powers. So those companies, those institutions also try to lock these countries, the former colonies, into a system where it would be impossible for them to develop. Okay, I have a question in the chat section. Let me see it. Oh, yeah. You want to thank you for your comment as well. Great. Now, let me move to the next board and write what we said up until this moment. Oh, or let me not write them. You can actually read them in your book, I guess. The book has all of these. Let's talk about another critical theory. And that is, interestingly, one of the theories that brings about a lot of different emotions, especially when I'm teaching this theory to undergraduates. A lot of students have problems accepting the theory's premises or understanding how different it is from the layman's understanding of that theory, and that is feminism. Feminism is, in my opinion, one of the most developed and one of the most progressive theories in social sciences and in humanities. Although many people would probably object to this statement, their objections would be based on the fact that they don't understand feminism very well. Feminism, from the time of its birth, has never been and is still not about men and women. It has always been about gender roles and the equality of opportunity for genders. So, for example, in the context of international relations, the discipline of international relations, and to a great extent international law as well, has often been depicted by male voices, meaning that whenever we had a feminist voice in the discipline, we have tried to suppress it. But in reality, that is not the best way to do it. One objection that feminists have had regarding the discipline of international relations has been that most of the theories that we discuss in international relations are based on the gender roles attributed to the male gender. Like whenever you're talking about war and being locked in a security dilemma, being locked in um, an anarchical system and the consequences that that anarchical system has on the relations between states, we are literally speaking of those roles that we in our normal life would attribute to males, to the male gender. Okay, let me put it in context. In our everyday life, whenever we see a fight in the street, when there are two men, we usually see them fighting, really fighting with each other, right? Getting physical with each other, not just verbal. In the on the other side, whenever you see, but of course I'm generalizing here, it's not always like this. You may see the opposite happening in these in this type of conflicts as well. Whenever you see, for example, the fight between women, it's more verbal than physical. Now let's take this concept, a very simple observation, and apply it to international relations. Whenever we are talking about war, what are we talking about? We are speaking of physical confrontation between states. Material power of advanced weaponry used as a way to physically confront your enemies. Whenever we are talking about security dilemma, to a great extent, we are, again, if we go to psychology of men and the psychology of women, to a great extent, we are referring to the psychology of the male gender. Even in our division of tasks in the society, we have the same problem. We divide the tasks based on the gender roles that our culture takes as given, takes as truth. But remember that in social sciences, there is no single truth. We always have many different versions of the truth. Now, for example, In many societies, they say, especially in Islamic societies, they say, well, the role of the woman is to be supportive of the man in the house, right? And the role of the man is to go out and do that. Sorry, the reason I'm talking about Islamic countries is not to say that it only happens in Islamic countries. I'm just giving you an example here. That is simply a gender role attributed to the men and women, to the male gender and female gender in a society. Now, to give you another example, and this has nothing to do with men and women now. Again, we are talking about gender roles. Boys who play with dolls, let's say, are considered to be, by the society, are usually considered to be weak, right? They're considered to be soft. Girls who act like boys are considered, again, I'm using the wrong sentences here. I'm saying act like boys, and I'm assuming that boys act in a certain way and girls act in a certain way as well. But when I say that, I'm assuming that you all think, or the majority of us think, that, oh, boys have to act in a certain way, girls have to act in another way. Now, if a girl acts in a way that you would think a boy should act, you would consider it strange. You would consider it that person an outlier, perhaps, in the society. And if the exact opposite happened, boys who acted like girls, for example, supposedly, again, quote unquote, you would consider that as something odd, as something strange, and you would probably not have a good attitude towards that as well. You would probably try to suppress that even. You would try to make the boy act like boys, make the girl act like girls, right? That's how we have been raised to think of gender roles. But that's not necessarily right. That's not necessarily the right way to do it. These are simply the characteristics, the ideas that we have created through our culture, through our exposure to a certain culture, through our exposure to a certain religion, even through our exposure to a certain language. In some languages, we do not distinguish between, for example, a he or a she, right? In the Persian language, we don't have that distinction, for example. There is no distinction. We use the same word for it, u, right? For both he and she. So it's gender neutral. The language is itself gender neutral. But languages, especially those languages that are not gender neutral, create an understanding of difference between male roles and gender roles. Those of you who speak French, for example, are probably familiar with this concept. If you are in a room filled with women and there is only one man in the group, how do you make your statements? Would you use the masculine form of the verbs, or would you address them in the masculine form or the feminine form? Based on my understanding, perhaps I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but you would use the masculine form. In other words, even the language itself is creating this concept, this understanding of difference. Right? Well, in fact, if you were to address such a crowd, you would have to use both forms of the verb, or perhaps the feminine form of the verb, or the pronoun, simply because the majority are women. Let me go to the chat section. I think this was a very interesting idea for the students. Okay. Rose says feminism is the rage of social movement, political movement, and ideologies that aim to define and establish the political, economic, personal, and social equality for the sexes. It is true, Rose, but I would go a step further and say it's not just the sexes in that sense, but of gender roles. So, for example, we try to, I say we, I proudly call myself, when it comes to such concepts, you can actually be many different things. You don't have to stick yourself with a tag and say this is who I am. But I proudly say that I'm a feminist. But anyways, it's not just the sexes, but it's gender roles. So, for example, when it comes to how people act in the society, the best thing to do, or perhaps the easiest thing, not the easiest, sorry, the most logical way to deal with societies is to disillusion the society regarding the gender roles, right? And the genders and the distinction that we make between the genders. It is a very hard thing to do, but it's doable. Survival says, I can tell you are trying hard not to offend any sex. You're doing great. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Now, I have a message. Please try to write your names there. It says iPhone, so I cannot really say who wrote this. It says, which class is this? Is it INTL 103? Yes, it is INTL 103 and INTR 101. They are both the same course. And Survival says this is the most delicate issue in today's society. That's true. And someone says, Sir, are you there? Yes, I'm here. Hi. Okay, great. So that was feminism. I'm not going to get into details about feminism because we also have a course called International Relations Theories, and I will explain all these theories to you guys. Again, feminism is categorized under critical theories of international relations. There are many other theories to discuss here. I'm not going to do that. We also have post-structural theories, for example, but they would probably be too hard for this class because they are mostly about perceptions and our understanding of the world and how our understanding is shaped and how we can actually break our understanding down and try to find the roots of our beliefs, the roots of our understanding of the world. And we can try to question them based on voices that have been suppressed. I'm not going to go there. It's too complicated for this class, I guess. But in the next semester, not next semester, but in 2 semesters, we will have a course in which I will deal with that. If I'm still here, I will deal with that extensively. Okay. This was the last part of our international relations chapter. Now, let me start with the international law section or chapter in your book. Well, it's a very, international law is a very interesting discipline that, in my opinion, is still very underdeveloped. I actually majored in international law. I have an LLM in international law, and my PhD is in international relations. So I have studied both disciplines. That's why I teach in both departments as well, although I prefer to stick to international relations. What's interesting about international law is that most international lawyers consider international law to be a separate discipline and independent field of studies. But in international relations, most international relations scholars consider international law a subdiscipline or a subfield of international relations. And the reason is obvious, because international law tries to regulate the interactions between states. Although it is very hard to do such a thing in an anarchical way, in an anarchical world, sorry, simply because the system has been structured in a way that there is no executive power there. In other words, there is no world government. There is no uh, world parliament, and there is no world judiciary system. We are used to think of legal systems as systems that have all these three characteristics, right? So in domestic systems, usually we have a lawmaking system, the legislature. We have uh, an executive system that acts based on the laws adopted by the legislature. And then we have a judiciary system whose job is to make sure that nobody violates the law and legal principles in the society. In international law, we do not have that. We have a bunch of states, around 200 states, close to 200 states, that can hardly interact with each other peacefully, and that have no other way of keeping themselves safe from invasion other than increasing their power, their own power, in relation to other states in the international society. Even though the word international society that I used is also quite a controversial word itself. If I were to talk about a theory in international relations that advocates international law and encourages its use, I would have to talk about this theory, the English School of International Relations. The English School of International Relations somehow falls on somewhere between the realist and the liberal theories of international relations. It does accept the realist principle that international relations is based on interactions between states, so states are the most important actors in international relations, and that states interact with each other under anarchy because all of them consider themselves sovereign, and there is no overarching power to control their interaction with each other. However, unlike what realists say, there's a level of harmony among states in the interaction between states. And this level of harmony is based on the states following a voluntary system of laws and regulations. And that voluntary system is what we call international law. Now, you could define international law as norms that regulate the interaction between states. I said norms and not laws or even regulations because international law is highly normative in nature. Now, what are the sources of international law? Where do these norms come from? Article 38 of the statute of the International Court of Justice defines the sources as 1. International treaties, 2. Customary international law, 3. General principles of international law, 4. The okay, we can actually call it doctrine. What is doctrine? The ideas of the most prominent international jurists. That is doctrine. Now, what are international treaties? These are simply agreements between states, right? So states negotiate particular agreements about a particular issue, and eventually they adopt certain norms in their relations with each other. And that's what we call a treaty. So treaties are agreements between states. They are also called conventions, protocols, etc. You may actually find a couple of words for that. Okay, let me not say etc. Etc. doesn't mean anything here, so let's just say and protocols. Although in international law terminology, there is a difference, for example, between a treaty between a convention and a protocol. Usually, we talk about the main document, the main agreement, as the convention or the treaty, and then we talk about the protocols not the protocols, attachments to the main document as protocols, or those documents that are in relation to the main document as protocols. Treaties are only applicable in relation in the relationship between, in relation to those states that have signed and ratified the treaty. So they are not applicable to those states that have not signed or ratified the treaty. Why do I say signed and ratified? Countries may sign a treaty or a convention. Representatives of states may sign them. But unless the treaty or the agreement has been ratified by those who have the authority to ratify a convention or a treaty inside the country, they do not come to effect. Okay? So basically, there is a difference between signing a contract. When you sign a contract or sign a treaty, it means that, you agree with it. In principle, you agree with it. And you are thinking, you are going to try to ratify it because you agree with the content. But then when you ratify the treaty, it means that you have accepted it, and you want the content of the treaty to be binding in your relationship with in relation to your interaction with other states. Okay. What else should I tell you about treaties? We usually distinguish between two types of treaties: bilateral treaties, bilateral treaties are agreements between two states. By means two. So whenever you hear by something, that's what it means. When you hear the word bizonal, it means there are two zones here. Bilateral, two parties to the treaty. Or we have multilateral treaties. Multilateral treaties are agreements between more than two countries, two states. We also call treaties between three states trilateral treaties, but they fall under the category multilateral treaties anyways. So these are agreements between more than two states. They are binding on the relations between the different parties that have ratified the treaty. So treaties are agreement-based. Most treaties have simply compiled the norms that exist, the customary norms that exist in the relations between states. So some of them are of course different. They may be norm-making treaties, in which case the treaty has created a new norm that may or may not become part of general international law later on. But most treaties compile already existing norms. Okay. I don't have to erase this, actually. Let me go to the next one. Customary international law. Customary international law is very similar to the common law system in the sense that it is based on practices. It is based on customs. The practices of states in a certain period of time become international law, at least in relation to those states who have continuously practiced in that particular way, practiced those particular practices in their interaction with each other. So, customary international law is quite similar to the common law system in the sense that it is based on the practices of states, but not all practices, on the long-lasting practices of states. These long-lasting practices become norms in international law, and they are, even if they're not written, they are binding in the relations between states who have practiced it in that particular way for a very long time. If the state has objected to that practice for a period of time, or at least from its beginning, from the very beginning, or from the beginning of its own existence, of the state's existence, then that particular norm, that particular custom is not applicable to that state. In the context of customary international law, we have norms that cannot be violated even if states agree on its violations. These norms are called peremptory norms of international law, or jus cogens. Importance that states cannot violate them even if they agree otherwise. To give you examples of such norms, the abolition of slavery, that's a jus cogens. So no state, no two states can agree on violating that norm. The abolition of torture, the ban on torture, sorry, that's a jus cogens norm. Ban on genocide, that's a jus cogens norm. So no country can go against
similar to
these peremptory norms, even if they agree on it.
common law system.
Okay.
Common law systems in the sense that it is based on the law.
Okay, sorry, I just muted everyone, so continue. Perfect. General principles of law. What are these general principles? Basically, when I say general principles of international law, these are usually the same as general principles of law in general. So, for example, ideas like, or principles like pacta sunt servanda. What is pacta sunt servanda? Observe your pacts or your agreements. So if you have an agreement with someone, you have to observe that agreement. You have to follow that agreement. You consider that a binding agreement, right? So that's pacta sunt servanda. Principles, general principles like this very basic principle of law are the principles that we are talking about here. So I'm not really going to talk about it much because I think it's self-explanatory. All those principles in law that are accepted as general principles are included in this definition. Now, the ideas of the most prominent jurists, or let's say international lawyers. The ideas of people like Brierley, like Hugo Grotius. In today's world, people like Marty Koskaniemi. These ideas can be used as sources of international law. But remember that even though the article does not really talk about a hierarchy between these different sources of international law, you could assume a level of hierarchy between these different sources. So if you have a treaty that does not require interpretation, you do not really have to resort to the ideas of jurists. If you have a customary norm of international law, like a jus cogens or an erga omnes, whatever it is, in international law, then you don't need to resort to the ideas of most prominent jurists. Again, if there is a general principle in law that can help you solve an international legal problem, then you don't have to resort to the ideas of most prominent jurists. The ideas of jurists are usually used as a subsidiary source of international law. Or let's say a secondary source of international law. It is only used when there is a gap in international law that has not been filled by customary international law, treaty law, or general principles of law, or in cases when norms exist, but they require interpretation. Used in cases where a gap exists in national law, gap filled by treaty law, customary law, general principles of law, or in cases where norms exist, but they require interpretation. Okay, so that's basically our discussion of the sources of international law. When it comes to international law, the most important thing to know of is the sources of international law. The rest of it is just related to substance. So, for example, if you are dealing with different maritime zones, you have to read the Convention on the Law of the Seas, the 1982 Convention. Or if you want to, for example, deal with a case that is related to refugees, you may have to resort to the 1951 convention related to the status of refugees, or the 1962 protocol to that convention. So basically, these are the different treaties or customary norms that you can resort to. But what's important for you at the moment is where to find those norms. And these are the sources where you can find the norms in order to understand the substance and to understand the content of the treaties and the content of customary international law, the substance of customary international law in relation to a particular case. Okay, I think somebody had risen a hand. Yes, Jonathan, please do ask your question.
Oh, it was a mistake. Sorry, sir.
Oh, it's okay. No problems with that. Great. Guys, as I said, I'm going to keep this a short session. I'm sorry that I have to cut this session short. I tried to include everything related to everything remaining from the previous chapter and everything related to the international law chapter as well. Of course, I could not mention everything, but I tried my best to mention all the important ones. If you have any questions, please do not stand on ceremony with me. You can send your questions either to my email or to my WhatsApp account. You all have my WhatsApp, I guess. If you don't, just ask me and I will send it to you. You can contact me through messages, preferably at any time of the day, and I will try to answer you as long as I'm not in a meeting, I'm not teaching, or I'm not in an important gathering. Okay. Yes, I think we have. Okay, Augustine says, please send your WhatsApp number. Sure, I will send it right now to the chat section of this group, 847-6177. And of course, the code is the Turkish code. Yes, that's my WhatsApp number, guys. You can use it to contact me anytime you want. Rose, yes, please ask your question.
Sir, are you going to give us quiz before our midterm?
Am I going to do what?
Are you going to give us quiz before our midterm?
Give you a quiz before the midterm, you mean?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I will not give you a quiz before the midterm, but I will give you a set of questions that can help you prepare for the midterm. And I will also give you summaries of the course. Hopefully, if I have time, because unfortunately in the last couple of weeks and also in the next couple of weeks, I'm very short on time. Basically, we are working from 8 o'clock, 8:30 in the morning to sometimes 10, 11 at night, simply because we are trying to balance the time here. So if I can prepare them on time, I will try to send you all the summaries, all the summaries and the questions by the end of the week, or latest by Tuesday next week. I am going to give you the timetable for the international relations exams as well. The reason I had not sent it to you is that we had made a change in it simply because 2 exams were on the same day, and I did not on the same day and date, and I did not want that to happen. I wanted you to have gaps between your exams. It wouldn't be fair on you to have 2 exams on the same day, sorry. I will send you the timetable today.
Okay, sir, thank you.
You're most welcome. Just for your information, the exams start on the 17th. So in 2 weeks, we are going to start the exams. Take great care of yourselves, guys. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. But before you go, let me just take a picture of the screen. So, one second. For the purpose of showing it to the administration so they know that you were present. It's more like our attendance list, right? Pictures, great. And next one. Another picture. Great, guys. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time. In the evening, for those of you who weren't here, we are not going to have the international law course. The introduction to law course. We had it on Tuesday this week. I was supposed to give you an extra session this evening as well. I'm not going to be able to do it because I will be in another meeting today until late in the evening. Okay, take great care of yourselves, guys. Bye-bye. Have fun.
Okay, sir. Bye-bye. Have a good weekend.
Thank you very much. You too.